Welcome. Not going to do the same thing I did this morning. It's totally out of my element. You can blame Buck Woody. I'm exhausted from that. That was like some sort of like doing a movie or something like that. It was crazy, but you guys enjoy it? It was kind of fun? Kind of interesting? Let's do more tech now. Let's not do the arcade circus. So I do know my name. I am Bob Borden, architect at Azure Data. February 20, as I getting ready to come to Excel Center, something happened, got in the way. By the way, that explains why you have the 2019 books all over the place. The SQL Bits team reached out to us a couple of months ago and said, by the way, do you realize we have a warehouse full of your books that was supposed to be given in 20? Can we bring them? I'm like, sure, but you know I'm going to talk about 2022, which is what this session's about. Now, some of you might have seen me online talk about this topic, and there's going to be a few things that are going to feel a little bit repetitive for you, but I've got some new stuff to show you, new things to talk about. And contrary to what happened in the keynote, I do have a demo for parameter-sensitive plan optimization. I'll spend a little more time kind of digging into what that looks like a little bit. So quick logistics, there's 50 minutes. You know, these are like lightning sessions, even the 50-minute ones. I think there might be some time at the end for questions. I can barely see folks in the back, though, because that light is like right here in my face. So we'll see if we have time for that. For folks online as well, welcome to you. My wonderful moderators here will be looking at your questions. So, by the way, bob.ward@microsoft.com. When you're here 29 years, you just get one name at Microsoft.com. I do like talking SQL Server, so I really mean this online here. If I don't get to your question, if you don't see me at the booth, right after this session, I'm going to the booth for 15 minutes. I've been told to sign books, so if you want to come over and chat with me, then you can do that. But if you want to email me because something came up, you just didn't get a chance to, I don't want you to go, I don't want you to miss out, because I just love coming to this event. I want you to make sure you get the questions you need. We are in private preview mode still, although you saw me make an announcement today. We'll talk about that in a second. But a version of this deck is right here in this website. SQL Server 2022 decks. They're in PDF format. I will be doing some demos. Since we're still in private preview, though, I don't have the demos published. Once we hit public preview, I'll publish everything. GitHub site, the whole shoot and match. Okay, let's talk about it. Let's get into a little bit. So I made a mistake in 2019. Traveled all over the world, 50,000 some plus miles, talking about SQL 19. I went to some of the largest customers in the world, and I started throwing out adaptive query processing and Linux and Query Store, and always encrypted. And they're like, what are you talking about? We're on 2008. I've never heard of that stuff. So whenever you talk about SQL Server 2022, if you don't know about these features, that's okay. It's my fault, not yours. But everything we're doing in 2022 has all this stuff in it. Plus, we've taken a few features and used this as a basis to make improvements or use as a foundation to move forward. You're going to see that in today's discussion. So I was asked by our leadership, can you help me with marketing produce a single slide on why you might consider moving to 2022? More of the why part. And a lot of the story does involve connecting to Azure, but a lot of it also involves work we're doing in the engine. So first of all, you heard me talk about today, the ability to use managed instance for disaster recovery. I will tell you this right now. I will spend time talking about the Azure connected features of SQL Server 2022 today, but I'm going to hold off demonstrating that because tomorrow, and as a speaker, you got to do shameless plugs for your other sessions. Tomorrow, I'm doing a talk specifically only on that topic. So all the demos for connecting to Azure for SQL Server, I will do those tomorrow. I'll go dive deeper in what you saw this morning. I'll do that tomorrow in my session called Hybrid Data Platform. But having a bidirectional disaster recovery site for SQL Server is a big deal, and especially because of the fact that it's now managed. Synapse being a popular technology for analytics, our team looked really hard at this problem space and said, we think we can take some of the work we've done in the past for things like change data capture, go harvest things in the transaction log, and feed that into Synapse seamlessly into SQL pools. And then we call that Synapse Link. And then you saw Evangeline talk about Purview. I'll mention it today, but have a deeper dive demo tomorrow. Plus, we have teams here talking specifically about Purview and security, about Purview and policies. So she showed you a little bit of the whole story about lineage. She showed you policy management. We have an interesting story to tell you a little bit today and deeper tomorrow about SQL policies, because she showed an example with Azure Blob Storage. So these three main areas represent cloud connectivity. We have a couple others that I'll mention today as well. So if you're thinking about, am I going to move to SQL Server 2022, one of the reasons you may think to do that is because I now, on my own terms, have the ability to connect to Azure. And instead of just doing a backup to URL, I connect to things like PaaS services. But I'm an engine guy. And you know that from a security perspective, and we have touted this, not because we're the ones tracking this, because NIST, the independent organization, is tracking this, still the least vulnerable database in the industry running for the last decade. But you heard us talk today about Ledger. We'll talk more about that in this session. I'll go dive deeper into what I showed you this morning. Plus, our colleagues from security have a session dedicated just to Ledger, I believe tomorrow here at the event. So Ledger is taking a feature and making you more secure about protecting your data integrity than just being least vulnerable. And then finally, you've seen us do benchmarks before, and I don't know if you know a little bit about benchmarking, but it's not us doing benchmarks, it's our partners wanting to do benchmarks, and they come to us and work with us. We don't have any benchmarks yet to announce for 2022 because the normal cycle, by the way, is our partners like Dell and HP and Lenovo work with us during the cycle of the preview. And usually when we go generally available, that's when we start releasing things like benchmarks on a new version of SQL Server. I can promise you, we are working behind the scenes to do that. From an availability point of view, though, there are things we're doing like multi-ripe replication, plus I have an actual small new announcement to make. You're lucky to be in the session to hear that today. I didn't make it in the keynote, reserving it for this session. But we will talk about built-in query intelligence, about performance. We'll talk about PSP, but I'll also talk about some other features we didn't talk about in the keynote. And my colleague Pedro Lopes has sessions this week as well to dive even deeper into that. So a little bit of the why. I presented this slide one time to a customer, and they said, I can't learn about all this stuff. That's just way too much stuff to learn about Azure Edge to Cloud. And I do take pride in the fact that we have consistency edge to cloud. We have the same T-SQL language. I realize there's some differences. It is the same engine code base powering these things. And we continue to make sure to invest at the tooling set, whether it's Management Studio or Azure Data Studio, work across everything that we do. Okay. So that's interesting, and you did hear me announce today public preview coming by the end of the first half of 2022. I couldn't give you a specific date, but Pedro Lopes, I worked really hard with him before this event. I said, can I say this? Pedro's running the release for us, and he said, you can say this. And I said, all right, Pedro, if we don't make that, you owe me a bottle of port or something, but we will make it. Before the end of the calendar year here, you will have your ability to download a public preview version of SQL Server 2022. And just to let you know, you're probably wondering, when is it going to be generally available? And I know you hate it when I say this, but I said this in 2019. I said this actually at this event in Manchester in 2019. We will not miss the name or we will lose our jobs. So it will be in this calendar year. If you know about big events for Microsoft, we love making splashes. So you go take a look. So in 2019, I built a slide with quadrants that talked about major capabilities of SQL 19. And I called that the camera slide because every time I put that up there, everybody got their phones out and want to take cameras of it, which is lovely and great. So this year, I decided to build in 2022 what I call the wheel of power. It's kind of like a wheel with spokes. So first of all, we already mentioned about Cloud Connected. We'll talk about each of these a little bit briefly, but again, tomorrow dive deeper from a demonstration point of view. But this is pretty significant because again, connecting to cloud services that are platforms of service in a unique way is pretty cool from a hybrid data platform perspective. So that's kind of the first piece of the wheel. The second piece being built-in query intelligence. And that's not a marketing term. We're the ones actually invented that term, and we mean it. What we want to do is make sure with no add-ons or anything that the engine itself provides the feature to give some intelligence to make you faster, continuing to pile on some of the work we've done in the past. This is a good example of us innovating on things that we've done in the past, making them even actually better. And the whole idea with this is we want to do it without you changing the app. That's kind of the promise we'd like to make to you, both as an administrator and as a developer. The third piece is the engine. And I call it the meat and potatoes of SQL Server for a reason, because it's core to what we do. It's all about security, scalability, and availability. We'll talk a little bit more about some of those. Pedro also, I've let him do the deep dive sessions this week on the engine pieces, so he's got really deeper insights into what we're doing in this space, but I certainly will talk about that today. The fourth part of this is data virtualization. You saw Anna Hoffman talk today about using data lake virtualization for managed instance. We've got a new functionality for data virtualization for SQL Server, building on what we've done in Polybase. We're also supporting something called object storage. You may have heard me give you a tease this morning in the keynote about restoring from Amazon, and I'll show you a demonstration of that today using that functionality. And finally, the fifth part of the wheel power is extending the T-SQL language. My colleagues Buck Whitty, Kendall Van Dyke have a specific session diving deeply into this. What are we doing in terms of JSON? What are we adding to the T-SQL language? What about time series? Are we doing something in that space as well? And they've got a session where they'll go deeply into it. I'll talk about it near the end of my session, but they've got a whole 50 minutes dedicated to this. This represents the wheel of power. I had several people over this calendar year, in the last calendar year, ask me, is there ever going to be another version of SQL Server? And, last year in the calendar year. I was excited not only that we're bringing a new version of SQL Server, but that we're actually bringing some pretty major stuff to the next version of what we're doing. Keep in mind that where it makes sense to do something, this also shows up in the cloud. So Azure SQL Database and Managed Instance, we work together all as teams to make sure engine innovations we're doing, and Anna's demonstration this morning of data lake virtualization with Managed Instance, it's a good example of that. So this is the Wheel of Power SQL Server 2022, and the intention of today's session is to dive more into some of these and talk more about them. Okay. So the way I usually present this, you saw a little bit of a flavor in the keynote this morning, is what's the challenge and what's the solution. And I mentioned this morning the challenge of disaster recovery, and it's a true story. I said it this morning in the keynote. I literally had several customers say, I love this feature because somebody built a DR site and they left the company and I have no clue what they did. And I'm the one that has to maintain this. So that's difficult to do. So what the Managed Instance team, and they're the ones that actually came up with this idea, not us, is said, we think that we can actually use Managed Instance as disaster recovery site. I remember early seeing this on this project. They're here this week to talk about it as well. And they said, you know what, we've looked at availability groups, we've looked at distributed availability groups, we think we can, on the SQL Server side, just use that. Like, don't even have to really change the engine, use that functionality, and then build some functionality in Managed Instance to make this happen. So the concept is this, you build your Managed Instance. You saw me demonstrate a little bit, we flew over it, I realized that. I'll dive deeper tomorrow. We built a Managed Instance, we deployed it already. We went into SQL Server with SSMS. That was kind of a preview of what that's going to look like from like a wizard point of view. You picked your database. You said, hey, I'd like to replicate this to the cloud, the Managed Instance. We handle behind the scenes what that does. It's actually all T-SQL based and PowerShell based to make that work. SSMS is just using a wizard on top of that. If you have an availability group, we'll just use it, build a distributed availability group behind the scenes, or as you saw this morning, if you don't have one, we'll build one for you. We'll start then replicating changes across a standard availability group mechanism, which is very fast. It's not like log shipping here. This is actually an AG replica scenario going on. Now, it is a DR site, by the way, so it's async. It's not a sync replica, because it's disaster recovery. So when you're ready to do that failover, as you saw me today, you could do a forced or a planned one. Planned one would be, I want to sync first before I make that change. And then one thing that I showed you was the fact that the databases are versioned together for compatibility reasons. What I didn't show you, and what we're still working on to make sure we do this for the general availability of SQL Server, is the ability to fail back. The ability to get your SQL Server back up as your secondary, and then fail back into SQL and make it back as the primary. Now, I want to make one thing clear here. The team that's built this calls it the link feature in Managed Instance. Think of this as the link feature in Managed Instance for disaster recovery. The team is also working on link feature for Managed Instance for migration. So if you've got a previous version of SQL Server, or 2022, and you'd like to set up your SQL Server to use the same technology to do read scale on Managed Instance, and when you're ready, migrate into MI, that same technology is called link feature for Managed Instance. So in one scenario, like in this scenario for 2022, it's specific disaster recovery. Previous versions of SQL Server are for read scale and for migration. But you'll see that same name show up in both mechanisms. The second piece of this was Synapse Link. And the team that's building this, both the Synapse team and our team, I remember seeing this myself also last year, saying, hey, Bob, we have this idea. What do you think? That happens a lot at Microsoft. I don't know why. Some people come ask me, what do you think? This is a good idea. Our customers like this. And I know Synapse fairly well. They're like, we're thinking about finding a way to get data into Synapse. I'm like, well, we have that today. You can just go sync up your SQL Server. You can create Azure Data Factory to do that. Like, no. We want to go build something like change data capture. We want to go into the engine and make some changes, and not specifically use that technology, but leverage some of that. Set up a SQL Server, go into Synapse and say, hey, I'd like to go pick some tables that I want to synchronize, seed those into Synapse, and then when changes just happen, we just naturally just feed them. And I'm like, how are you going to do that? Because you know, a SQL pool in Synapse doesn't understand transaction log changes. What are you going to use, just T-SQL somehow? They're like, no, no, no. We have this really interesting idea, and we'll talk about this tomorrow in the architecture, that we think we can use Azure Blob Storage as a landing zone, like an intermediate step. We can take data from Synapse, we can turn that into like Parquet files or files that are native, something that Synapse can understand, that ADF can understand, and we'll just ingest those and feed those into SQL pools. Now, one thing to call it significant here is this. Cosmos DB link for SQL Server is great technology, but the data is in Cosmos DB. So one thing that I didn't do a good job when I first announced this last year is that the data is directly put into SQL pools. Like, we actually build SQL pool tables, we seed them in SQL pools, and then we feed the changes into SQL pools. So you use the full scalability of what used to be called Azure Data Warehouse, and of course with Synapse now combining all of this with different technologies like Spark, or even you saw Patrick talk today about Power BI. I don't know, I thought my visualization was pretty cool, but you know, I am no Patrick LeBlanc, so. And again, the thinking here is, can we mitigate the need to do ETL? Can you just go set up a SQL server and link it, and it all just works? The third piece is security, and we talked a little bit about Purview, but one thing that we didn't talk about, you didn't hear about today, you might have heard earlier, was the fact that Azure Active Directory authentication is coming. That's going to be super cool, especially like in a virtual machine environment, where you want authentication, not SQL authentication, but you don't want to prop up domain controller. So that's coming in for SQL Server 2022. Purview, which we'll talk about in our second, and then Microsoft Defender for SQL. I'm so excited. The Defender team is here this week talking about their technologies. And so Defender for SQL is something as well we're supporting, just like we're doing today for other versions of SQL or other versions of Azure SQL. Specifically for Purview, it's interesting. It's a technology that we've been working on for a while, and the idea is that there is a central place to do some stuff. Evangeline showed you some really cool demos. She's got other deep dives. We have our rest of our own Purview team here this week, and then of course I'm going to dive even further tomorrow. But the idea is this: I want some central thing for insight, central part for governance. And so Evangeline was talking about metadata and lineage, which I think those things are amazing. The piece that I'm going to focus more on when I talk about this is policy management. So imagine a world where I actually hire Stuart Padley, who I see walking by right now. He's laughing when I see this. I take Stuart Padley and I say, hey man, Stuart's not a sysadmin for me. I can't give him those rights. But what I want to do is make him my performance monitoring expert, because he's got an expertise in that. So what I can do is I can go into Purview and I say, hey, Stuart's a performance monitor for my organization. And then I just say declaratively, which SQLs do I want him to do that for? Hit the word publish, and boom, it's pushed down to the SQL servers. You don't have to connect directly to make all that work. You don't have to give him logins, you have to set up special policies or permissions. He now has the ability to go across these and do those operations. And then when Stuart says, Bob, I'm out of here, got a better job, I can just go into Purview and say, oh, Stuart's not doing that anymore, publish, and it's just removed from all those systems. Love that technology, working across all of our Azure SQL assets, and specifically on the premises working for SQL Server 2022. Okay, that is the first part of the wheel of power. What about intelligent query processing? What about built-in query intelligence? You've seen us talk in SQL 17 about adaptive query processing and 19 about intelligent query processing. That was kind of a rebranding of that name. It's all about the challenge of tuning and being expensive, time-consuming, maybe application changes, putting in query hints, doing all those kind of type things. And some of those things are still possible. In fact, if you first look at this technology, let's talk about the query store. We've made a determination based on our telemetry, based on our work with customers, based on work with you about fixing and making sure the query store is better. We think we can now turn on query store by default for new databases. You upgrade, we won't do that, but if you got a new database in 2022, we'll turn it on by default. We will finally support read replicas for availability groups. Yay! Yeah, that's a little clap from that. The cool thing about this, by the way, is that because it's read-only still in replicas, we'll store all the data on the primary. But we've added metadata now in the query store to tell you was your query from a primary or a secondary, and we can use the availability group technology to transport that information back and forth to know what that looks like. So that's coming for SQL Server 2022. And if you've seen Query Store Hints, which is in preview now for Azure Database, think of this as a better plan guide option for you. Like the ability to use the Query Store to put a hint for a query and persist that into the Query Store so you don't have to change the app itself. But what about intelligent query processing next generation? So the idea is this. In some cases, like I showed you this morning, can we take some scenarios and I'll show you a slide in a second how this all works from compat-wise. In some scenarios, can we use the query store as a mechanism to do feedback? Can we store information about execution and inside the engine look at that information, and then on subsequent executions just get faster and get better for you? I mean, who doesn't struggle sometimes with degree of parallelism scenarios, or what about cardinality estimations? That's a killer for me, right? So, we don't know if this will be the panacea for you. We're not sure yet, right? But we built it based on your problems you've sent to us. So those two scenarios are good ones using the query store. And of course, the one on the right, parameter sensitive plan optimization, or known as parameter sniffing, Pedro showed you a demo of that, and I'll also show you that in a second. Before I do that, let me dive a little bit more into all the different IQP features we're doing, and a little bit how this is going to work from a progression from you upgrading to 2022, and then going all the way to changing the compat level. So bear with me and see if this all makes sense. So first of all, if you upgrade to 2022, and you're using a DB compat from 17 or 19, those are the numbers that relate to that, right? I call those Gen 1 and Gen 2 features. It's just in the query processor. So let's say you go to 2022. If you're running on 140, you get Gen 1 functionality plus what I'm about to show you. If you're on 150, which is both of those, you'll get both of those features and what I'm about to show you. What I mean is, we're going to do these things, we're going to do these things right here without the need to change DB compat, okay? Without the need to change. So by the way, if you're on DB compat 130, you get these three things right here. That's pretty interesting, right? So we decided, made investments in some scenarios to not require DB compat change to light up some functionality. Approximate versions of functions we had distinct before, now we're doing percentiles. Query compilation replay is about persisting compilation steps in the query store to make sometimes loading a lot of plans faster. And then I mentioned about DOP feedback. I think Pedro has some demos and things to show you in his deep dive session. That's both these using the query store as this persistence mechanism to make those faster. And we'll actually go in behind the scenes to adjust DOP for you to smooth out the workload based again on the feedback loop we're getting from the query store. So again, these three things just by going to 2022, independent of your compat level. But don't forget, if you're on 140 or 150, you get previous things that I showed you before, like memory grant feedback and those kind of type things. All right, so if you are on 140 plus and on 2022, okay, if that makes sense, if you're on 140 plus in 2022, we've taken the memory grant feedback mechanisms and made them better. So we're using a different algorithm for memory grant feedback to make it a little bit smoother, not so rocky back and forth, and it's finally persisted. Before, when you had memory grant feedback and you rebooted SQL Server, we lost track of what that was. Now we're using the query store to persist that information. So even a plan is evicted from cache, you still get to take advantage of that feedback mechanism. Okay, then finally, with DB compat 160, think about the progression you might be making. We will light up parameter sensitive plan optimization, which we're fixing to talk about some more. And we'll also do the cardinality estimation feedback model we talked about. And we're going after those specific CE model scenarios that have troubled you when you've upgraded to a newer version of SQL Server and we need a new CE model. Remember this whole song and dance you do to set the legacy model because you run into some problems? Okay, so we don't know if we can solve all those, but we're trying. We actually looked at the ones you've told us are causing you issues. And when you run into them, we're going to look at those patterns and see if we can make adjustments to make you faster with using this new CE model. That would be kind of a nice thing, right? So it's a pretty cool laundry list of things we're doing. And notice the thing at the top, the cloud first mechanism up there, since it's in the query processor, these things start in the cloud first. Here's the interesting thing we're at right now in our business, though. We're running pretty rapidly for you. We're talking about some of these, and some of these things haven't even been discussed yet in Azure Database publicly, but they'll light up that way. So you might see some variation here where public preview hits for 2022, and some of these show up. They're not an Azure Database public preview, but I can guarantee you the query processor engine has all of them for Azure Database, SQL Server, and Managed Instance. Okay, so I like to show this demonstration to kind of make it clear visually if you're not sure exactly what I'm talking about from a parameter sensitive plan optimization or PSP. Why don't I just call it that from now on? Or how about parameter sniffing? It is not true. I did not invent that term as far as you know. You can try to ask some people, did I create that? I probably did back when I was in CSS because I got tired of this problem. Maybe Keith Elmore, a colleague, created that term. All right, here's the scenario. You have an application relying on a stored procedure, a select statement inside of it. uses a where clause. The where clause based on a parameter, it's an integer value. You run the procedure with a value of 1, and based on statistics, we do a seek, because it's pretty fast to do that based on the number of rows we go after. You're all lovely, everything's happy. The app user has no idea this is going on. They just know things are fast. So planned cache eviction happens out of your control for whatever reason. That goes out of cache. Another user comes in for the same application, uses the same sort of procedure, different value. This is sounding familiar. And because it's a 10 in this case, we got to get a lot of rows. A scan is faster and better for that value, so we put a scan in cache, and then the first user, whatever comes back in, the next time they refresh the screen, and they're upset because we have to use a scan, because only one plan can be a cache for the same store procedure or same parameterized statement. So with DB Compat 160 with 2022, what do? Same scenario. But when we hit this point, in this point in time, the query processor can recognize when this procedure runs at any point in time and say, that's not the right plan for that type of parameter value. Let's fork it. Let's have 2 plans now. Now, it's not like we're sitting behind the scenes going, oh, we only have 1 plan, let's have 2 or 3 or 4. Each execution, we take a look at its scenario and decide, is the plan in cache best for that parameter value? And it's not a query plan per user either. I realize when we're showing this so simply, it seems like, oh, you must be 1,000 of these things. So we get pretty smart about this. But we use statistics to make determinations what parameter values match a certain plan better than others. So maybe you're going to find yourself with 5 plans at some point, depending on what's going on. Let's stop and take a look at it a little bit deeper. So it isn't true. I really do know how to demo this. Oops. I'm going to get out of the deck here. This is a local 2022 I have on my laptop, actually. I decided not to use the cloud in this case, just going to go local with my own Hyper-V. That brings back the old days of doing demos. So over here, what I did is, and I just give you a little more inside scoop of what I did in these demos a little bit, right? So I took the wide role importers database. I love kind of doing that because it's a standard database you can just grab. And I took one of the tables and I added a bunch of data to it, so I had a lot more rows than in the standard wide role importers database. And I created a procedure to go get stock items by supplier. It's kind of like a name of going after a table with a where clause, right? So if I go out here and I run this with, say, a 4, it needs an index scan. That's just normal to its scan because a 4 requires a bunch of rows to go after. But if I go after this with, say, a 2, sorry, actually, this is interesting because it actually hit the problem when I was doing this. Let's go back and run this again. Let's run this here. Notice here, this does a seek, right? So it's very fast. This came back in like less than a second, really, really fast, right? But over here, if I run with a 4, it needs a scan. Now, unfortunately, this scenario right now with the database compat I'm running cannot occur at the same time. It's either got to be a seek or a scan, one or the other, for the same store procedure. But I'm showing you the scan because what I did here, I faked the system by clearing out the procedure cache, simulating a planned cache eviction. So let's look at it more from a workload point of view. A little bit what Pedro showed, but a little bit different. Now, behind the scenes, just to let you know what I'm doing, I usually run this command. That is going to set the compat level to 150, clear the query store, and actually in this particular case, notice I've got some trace flags because in private preview, we're lighting this up with a few trace flags. So a little behind the scenes stuff that we do sometimes in private preview. We require a few trace flags to kind of get this all worked out. Public preview hits, we won't need that. You won't need these trace flags. So you feel free to go look at that, but it doesn't mean you would need that in public preview. So I set these to make sure I'm at that level. It's just a way to consistently make sure you do your demo. And then I'm going to do this. Remember those stored procedures I was just doing? I am going to run ostress, this ostress tool I like to use all the time, with a 2, because I know that's going to get a seek, with 25 users, see right here, like 1,000 times. So here's the rub. That query, if you run it like 1 time, even in a scan scenario, doesn't take all that long. But it almost is like a second. Well, this is a common pattern I've seen with performance problems with customers. They go after the smoking gun for one real long query, when it turns out it's one query that runs a ton of times, right? But it takes longer than they expect. So let's go do the seek and see what it looks like. What I've got here as well is I've got perfmon, and what Pedro did is show you batch requests. I'm adding processor time a little bit to show you a pattern here and a symptom of the problem. So let's go do that. Now, if I go over to perfmon, I'm going to notice pretty high throughput for batch requests per second, and decently sized CPU time, but it takes a short-lived time. And the reason it's CPU bound because it's all in memory at this point, but it's still just doing seeks. So let's go simulate over here the planned cache eviction. Let's simulate the scenario, what I showed in the diagram. Clear the procedure cache to simulate a planned cache eviction, run the scan, then go back and run the seek again. Now, perfmon is so beautiful to show you these scenarios, right? Let's stop and see what it looks like. Can you notice the complete drop in degradation in performance? Look at that. Like totally out of off a cliff. And then notice here, complete 100% CPU. Why? Because all those users now are scanning the index, everything in memory. So a complete peg of CPU. In fact, it's running in parallel to do that. It forced parallelism on me because it's look, I got to brute force make this thing run fast. So I'm going to run a bunch of parallel threads to just scan the index and run as fast as I can. Unfortunately, if you just let this thing go, look at this. It just goes. In fact, it's so bad. It took like 3 seconds to run before. It's still running. I can't stop it here. I'll cancel it. If I let it go, it takes like 10 minutes versus 3 seconds to run. Because again, we're just hammering the CPU. I could throw more CPUs at this and maybe it'll run faster, but that's not an efficient way to do it. So what do we do? So we're going to go over here. We're going to set the compat level to 160. Going to clear the cache to kind of clear my whole demo scenario, but all I'm going to do is set compat level to 160. And I'm just going to crank it again. Let's do it. Index seek should take about 3 seconds or so, maybe less. 2.9, run the scan. Now, if you are an app user, you don't know this is going on in the scenes, but you expect this to run all the time the same, and that's exactly what's going to happen. So if you look here, look at the pattern here. See that? That's the second pattern. So the second time I ran, I was consistent to the normal pattern. Here's like that first peak. You see it's off the end of perfmon here. Here's that first run of the 3 seconds, and here is the second run. Almost identical performance. Didn't even touch it, just did DB compat level. In fact, what is it, 3.3 versus 2.9? So go look in the query store to kind of get an idea of what's going on. And now, one thing to be clear, I showed this before and somebody said, oh, you must need the query store for this. Nope, you don't need the query store. I'm just using it to look at the insights of what happened. And the first thing out of the gate that somebody said to me, like, I'm confused. I thought it was the same store procedure. Okay, so it turns out, Pedro alluded to this a little bit today, and I promise you we picked this name before the pandemic. We used something called a variant. Sorry. That's what we chose as a name for this way back a long time ago. So what we end up doing is we have something called a variant of the plan. So it turns out there are multiple plans for the same store procedure, but in Query Store, it kind of looks like 2 different text statements. Here's the thing. They hash to the same text value. So let's look at that to make sure you understand. Because I remember that came out, and I didn't say that when I first demoed this, and I should have. Let's see here. Yeah, Query Store DMVs. So if you go look at text, you'll see there are 2, actually there's 3 text here, but you see it looks like the same thing, but it's got this query variant text with it. Here's these variant text with it. You're like, oh, that's not good. But if you go to Query Store Query, if you've seen some of these DMVs, notice right here, they all hash the same query hash value. So if you're going to use Query Store and go, oh, how do I find the performance of the same parameterized query, you would group on the hash now instead of like a text. So it looks like the same, it looks like different text, but it really is the same, and it works for parameterized query or store procedures. So there are some things behind these things you should know. Right now, it only looks for equality clauses. That's the current design of we're starting out, and there could be some limitations you're running into. We're going for the 80-20 rule here, to be quite frank with you, and I'm really curious to see how this is going to really lay out. People that have already started to play with this say they really like it, but when we hit public preview, it's going to be really interesting to see all of you start really hammering this, and will it solve you from parameter sniffing problems? So that is parameter sensitive plan optimization. Again, DB compat level, I didn't change the code, I just got faster. Okay, so now the third part of the wheel is the engine. Even though query processing is the engine, I decided when I built this to start out that built-in query intelligence, even though it's part of the engine, it deserves to be called out as its own thing, right? Versus what we might be doing from these areas in the engine. So first of all, for security, there's a bunch of stuff we're doing. I got a slide right after this to kind of make your head blow away a little bit. There's a lot of stuff we're doing in these spaces. But one I talked about this morning is called Ledger, and we will dive into that a little bit. The second is scalability. Typically what happens when we build a new release of SQL Server is we've built up a set of customer issues, or issues, quite frankly, sometimes we learn from benchmarking, and we go enhance the engine without you knowing about it, actually. But I always love talking about it because you're like, how did I get faster? So one of the things that's near and dear to David Pless's heart, our colleague David Pless, is TempDB latching. So we're enhancing the concurrency of latches for system pages like GAM and SGAM, making them even faster, more concurrent. That way that hopefully that final piece of TempDB latch concurrency can go to nothing if you're using optimization, TempDB optimization for metadata, and you're using the latest version of SQL Server. Okay, so availability, here we go. So we are announcing today that coming soon, contained availability groups are coming to SQL Server 2022. You've seen that today in Arc, which means, yes, now in an availability group, you will be able to replicate your agent jobs and logins. That will be now part of the SQL 2022 release, and you will see that when we hit public preview. That happened between Pedro and I this past week to make this decision to announce it. So I don't have a demo for you here today to see that. You can thank our great friend Kevin Farley, who many of you know in the industry. He's one of our colleagues. He's really hard behind the scenes to make us land for SQL Server 2022. I don't know what the final name will be called, but the concept is, within availability group now, your agent jobs, your logins, your link servers, all of that become replicated to a secondary. In addition, cross-platform snapshot backups are interesting to some of our partners, because now we're going to build in T-SQL commands to freeze I/O. So you can go along and do snapshot-based backups with VDI processes, but don't require the volume snapshot writer from Windows now. You can just do it through T-SQL. And then I mentioned that the Intel Quick Assist in the keynote. Intel's already written a white paper on this. We started working with them closely. It's a hardware-based technology that allows you to get better compression, faster compression. And here's the cool thing, because the Quick Assist is doing the compression part, you offload the CPU workload from threads in SQL Server to do the actual compression work. So they've got some pretty interesting numbers they're putting together to see how that lands for their technology. Okay. Let's talk about a few other ones. One that may be interesting to you is TLS. So we will have a new version of, we will support the latest version of TLS, and even a new protocol where we put in TLS packets in a TDS packets in a single frame for TLS to make it even more secure. Auto drop statistics is an interesting that might be interesting. And then look at these scale things that we're doing right here. These things are, just they add up to some interesting stuff, but let me call it like parallel redo. Some customers saw us do parallel redo in previous versions, but we were limited on how many databases. Now we just open it up and let everybody enjoy parallel redo. So what usually happens when we launch SQL Server in our docs is like there's a what's new page. And you're going to see a lot of this stuff show up there together. Some of it may be on your list of something you've been thinking about. But like I said, Pedro will probably dive into some of these in his deep dive tomorrow. I believe it's tomorrow or Saturday. Let's talk about Ledger, and I mentioned today that challenge when our customer wants the power of blockchain. And it's funny because when I was thinking about doing this presentation, I thought, what really does people think about blockchain? Is it negative, is it positive? But if you really look up a definition for what it really means, it's all about tamper evidence track record, or tamper resistance track record. So it can't necessarily prevent you from hacking the database. You saw me this morning try to do that, right? But it sure can give you tamper evidence that's going on. So let's kind of look at it together of what it really means. So it is all based on T-SQL, and when you first use the technology, it's going to feel like a temporal table, because you're going to use a syntax like temporal, except you're going to say the word ledger with it. And when you do that, you get a table in SQL Server that now, when we update things, we have a history table. But unlike temporal, that history table says who did it. So who was logged in SQL Server that made the change, which why you saw today Buck show that Bob was the one that did the update statement. And then you have a view that we support, we build automatically for you to see that. What do the changes look like across my table? When do they occur, and who actually did it? Now behind the scenes are a series of system tables. System tables that support a cryptographic hash of what we changed, which is why I went in and did some stuff, and I'll talk about kind of what I did. I won't show you exactly what I did. Sorry, there's got to be some secrets in your job, right? But I will behind the scenes kind of talk about what I did a little bit. and I try to go in and fudge the system to pretend that I didn't make the change, but the ledger is going to have a hash to say that I did make the change or that something got tampered with. And if you saw a little bit what Buck showed you, we just flew through that thing though a little bit. It was a fun thing to show you, but I'm going to show you more deeper. There's a separate trusted storage facility where we take a version of this and copy it over there. Think of that like a checksum now. So all of a sudden somebody who's like a regulator could then compare what's in the trusted storage and go, whoa, gosh, 10 minutes. Wow, that's pretty fast. God, thank you. Wow, I'm just flying through, aren't I? So let's just flip over for a second and just show you briefly, because I want to make sure I show you my Amazon demo. Got to show you that one. This is why you have a lovely moderator to help you. Okay. So that Contoso database, remember what we showed you was these notebooks that I was flying through a little bit? So just to give you an idea of what I have here. Inside ledger. So when I go in and make this change from the ledger, first of all, when you first run this history table, it's empty because I haven't made any changes, but there's a bunch of inserts in there. So this is the ledger view to show me all the inserts in the system that populated the table. And behind the scenes, here's these system tables I talked about to show you the actual transactions. But if you go here, here are the blocks that we did. Now, Buck generated a digest. We can do that manually, but we're working on a system like with Azure Database where we would automate this process for you. So this is where you would store this digest separately. So when I make an update directly to the system, it knows it's admin in this case. It's not Bob doing it. I can go in here. I can see the changes, but then I go into the history table, excuse me, in the ledger view, and I can see, sorry, it's a history table, sorry. I can see that, sorry, get back here. I see transactions, but in the ledger view, I thought this is where, I don't have the right view set up here, but you can go in the system to see this in a combination to see the fact that it was Bob making the changes, plus the fact that it was a ledger. Now, I'll just give you an inside trick of what I did. What I did is this. Here's this ledger history table, right? It thinks there's a change. Do you see that? What I did is, I went in the system cleverly, and I removed that. I found a way to get under the covers, which I can't tell you what I did, and I got rid of this thing so the ledger didn't think I made a change. And then what I did is I did a delete of the salary and an insert, and I removed the record of the fact that I did the delete insert, the original insert. So my insert showed up like it was just the new insert, but the ledger doesn't know I did that. But the hashes do. The hashes say, well, that doesn't line up with what was originally there. So what did I do? I went into those system tables and got rid of the hashes under the covers. So then there was no record of anything. But what was there? That separate trusted storage was out there. So the digest was stored separately, and when it compared itself to the system table, it says, hey, wait a minute, you don't have the right hash, you stored her separately for what you have in the system table. So I'm behind the scenes mucking with system tables to fake the system that my salary update, it was the original insert of the salary. But along the way, it always caught me because it has this hash and a comparison to what's in the ledger itself. It was kind of fun to put that together. I see my colleague Jakob here sitting in the front. He laughed when I sent him the steps that I did. He goes, how did you know to do that? And I said, well, in the day in CSS, I used to do that for a living. So anyways, I didn't hack your systems. I just fixed customers' problems. So, okay, let's talk about data virtualization to kind of close out some of our stuff today, because I want to show you this demonstration. And the idea is that, first of all, we are now going to use an extend polybase to use open row set external table to go after Parquet, JSON, CSV, and Delta, like Anna showed you, but notice S3 being a no protocol being supported. In addition, we're going to allow you to do a native backup restore to S3 using the URL syntax. And so I promised you I'd show this demo. In fact, let me just go through this first real quick here. Just to tell you it's really true, I really did set up an Amazon account with RDS. And I went through the process with SQL Express Edition to take wide role importers, restore it into RDS through S3 buckets, and then I turned around and did a backup of Amazon through that system. And if I flip over here and show you my notebook, this is me literally running this is the Amazon one. This is me running on, this is using a notebook to connect to AWS running 19. and I went through the process of doing an on-demand backup to what's called an S3 bucket. That's S3 storage in RDS, right? Or excuse me, in AWS. So you got RDS and S3. So then when I backed it up, I could go into SQL, and I have like the URL for this, right? The URL for S3. I can now go into SQL Server, and once I create a credential to map, and I get that from my Amazon account, and you don't worry about copying that, I've already deleted all this. I'm not exposing anything. But here's the command. I promised you there would be one command. Well, in this particular case, I'm doing a file list only. But there's one command with a restore I can run to restore the database. I can simply say restore database, URL, and notice the S3 syntax inside it. So you've got RDS databases and you want to do an offline migration to SQL 2022, you can do that directly with what we're building in the system, or you might have some other S3 system that you'd like to back up and restore natively into S3. All that exists. And when we go to public preview, I'll publish all of that stuff that I did. Okay, so language enhancements for developers. We're going to improve JSON functions and make them better. Again, Buck and Kendall have a session where they'll dive more into these examples. Enhance T-SQL surface area. How about improving some of the string functions we're doing, or Windows clauses? And finally, if you've never seen time series, which is part of Azure SQL Edge, we're taking those functions that you use to process time series data in Azure SQL Edge, and we're taking that support and bringing them into the SQL Server engine itself. So I encourage you to look at their session to see, are those things that I might need? And since it's part of T-SQL, it will show up everywhere SQL exists. So we did a flyby of SQL Server 2022, an introduction. I hope what you saw, though, today was something that interests you. Something like, I think I might consider upgrading to 2022, because you think about the wheel of power, it's either about cloud connected, built-in query intelligence, security, scalability, availability, data virtualization and object storage, or enhancements to T-SQL. All four of those categories make up everything we're doing. You do want some more resources, I'm sure. And I told you that right now, SQL Server 22 decks have a PDF version of what I'm showing you. But if you want to see more demonstrations that I showed you today, there are some video-based series you can watch, whether that's on mechanics, whether that's a webinar, or even on PASS Summit last year, SQL PASS TV. They took our presentations we did, and they actually recorded all those and put those out there. And then we always show up on Data Exposed to do all sorts of fun stuff. I've got some great plans in this calendar year to do a lot more Data Exposed, to dive deeper into all the 2022 features. I'm so excited that you came here to the BITS conference today, and you're getting all this session and knowledge. So I am heading right after this session to go over to the booth to sign books, if you'd like to do that. I'd love to chat with you more about this. Again, I'm doing a hybrid data platform session tomorrow, a deep dive on 2022. Pedro has deep dives on the engine and built-in query intelligence. And Kendall and Buck are doing a deep dive on some of the language enhancements. So I hope you found this useful to get you interested in 2022 and learn more about it. Look forward to seeing you around for the rest of the conference. Bob Ward at Microsoft.com for questions. Thank you.